Is America prepared to deal with the fact that foreign countries come to our soil and commit political crimes?
The U.S. is not immune to foreign assassination attempts. Just this month, 2 men with ties to the Russian mob were convicted in a plot to kill an Iranian-American journalist and women's rights activist living in New York.
China's repatriation squads enter the sovereign territory of the United States and deploy intimidation and other tactics to force them back into China, where they would face certain imprisonment or worse following illegitimate trials.
For the second time in only about 6 months, we're learning of an alleged assassination attempt by the Indian government on North American soil.
As of 2023, the State Department published that 39 countries have attempted to reach across borders into America to try and intimidate, harass, abduct, or even kill their political enemies who are living here. This threat is called transnational repression, and it's a direct challenge to American sovereignty and the very freedoms that our Constitution stands for. But because these breaches of our national security are usually targeted against immigrant, exile, or diaspora communities, they tend to get missed in the mainstream news, or if they are covered, it's only for a fleeting moment. And that lack of attention doesn't just impact the targets of transnational repression. In some cases, it's meant that our own law enforcement was so unprepared for this threat that foreign governments were able to manipulate and use American law enforcement to do the repression on their behalf. So if foreign governments can get America's law enforcement to go after their own political enemies, how far behind are we in dealing with this threat? So in this video, I'm going to take a look at some prominent examples of transnational repression and the strategies repressive regimes use to go after dissidents and how they've gotten our law enforcement to do their dirty work. I'm also going to take a look at what our government has and hasn't done to stop this and why SB 509, a bill that can make California the third state in the country to legislate against transnational repression, is actually exposing a huge divide that's in my own diaspora. But first, a quick shout out to my Patreon community. Y'all make my videos possible, and if you're watching this and want to support, you can join for free or as little as $1 a month at patreon.com/angitjising. And make sure to subscribe and leave a comment in this video as well. So what does transnational repression actually look like here in America? To be totally honest, I hadn't even heard of these two words in a sentence until my diaspora was in the middle of it. Back in 2023, Hardeep Singh Nijjar was gunned down in the parking lot of his Gurdwara, and months later, Canada and the United States accused India of a plot to assassinate Sikh Americans and Canadians across their countries. The murder plots targeting Sikh Americans in New York and California were foiled by federal agents, and according to court documents and ongoing trials, Indian agents and government officers were allegedly recruiting hitmen and criminals locally to carry out their political agenda. India accuses their targets of being terrorists, even though they've provided no compelling evidence to back up their claims. But apparently, this isn't an uncommon tactic. 53% of physically targeted individuals are labeled as terrorists by perpetrating governments, and in many cases, those charges don't have any merit. Since I learned about the Indian murder plots, I've been reading more about transnational repression. And I've read about how Iran recruited biker gangs like the Hells Angels, or Russian mobsters, or Latin American criminal syndicates to carry out their agenda. Or how the Chinese were trying to use well-connected political fundraisers to lobby their agenda in government. Or how they established secret police stations across the country, or even organized grassroots diaspora groups to counter demonstrators who were protesting against Xi Jinping when he visited San Francisco. To some extent, it makes a lot of sense that a foreign repressive regime would try things like paying off criminals or lobbyists or activating diaspora groups who feel super patriotic towards them to carry out their agenda of silencing dissent. But when a foreign government is able to co-opt our legal systems and law enforcement officers to do their dirty work, that's when you know America has not done enough to be up to speed with the realities of this threat. So I wanted to share 2 examples of how foreign governments get America to do their repression for them. On the individual level, let's take the case of Michael McMahon, a retired NYPD sergeant working as a private investigator who was sentenced this year to 18 months in prison. His crime? Stalking a Chinese origin family in New Jersey and acting as an unregistered agent of China. The New Jersey family he was surveilling were targets of China's Operation Fox Hunt, which Beijing calls an anti-corruption drive, but US officials have called it lawless behavior to stalk, harass, and blackmail American citizens and permanent residents. And even though prosecutors found more than enough evidence to convict him, McMahon insisted before his sentencing that, quote, "I never thought for 1 minute I was working for China." Now, whether or not you believe McMahon is not the point I'm trying to make here. The fact that a highly decorated former NYPD investigator was recruited by the Chinese government to do their repression is enough evidence in and of itself that he was not trained enough to realize that he should make a better choice. And McMahon isn't the only one. The FBI has charged several current and former officers across agencies, from the Department of Homeland Security to state-level corrections departments, for sharing sensitive information in government databases with foreign powers and even helping them spy on, stalk, and attempt to harm dissidents, and in one case, targeting an American Army veteran who was running for Congress. Besides co-opting individual officers, the other way our law enforcement gets exploited by foreign powers who are committing transnational repression is through weaponizing our immigration and justice system. A recent policy paper by the New Lines Institute argued that sometimes foreign repressive regimes can make unlawful arrests and detentions of political enemies more easily in the United States through our immigration system than they can in their own countries. And one of the most common ways this is done is through something called Interpol Red Notice abuse. So a red notice is essentially a global alert that's filed through Interpol by countries who are looking for wanted criminals abroad. But authoritarian regimes often file bogus notices against their political opponents as a way of getting foreign countries to arrest them on their behalf. And in the past, US agencies like ICE and the DHS have acted on these notices, leading to wrongful arrests and detention. Take, for example, the case of Jessica Barahona Martinez, a single mother who fled El Salvador in 2016 with her children seeking asylum. A year after she came to the US, ICE arrested her at a regular check-in based on a red notice that El Salvador had filed against her, alleging that she had extorted $30 for a gang. But it turns out she'd actually already been acquitted for those charges once before, and her lawyers argued that the charges that El Salvador had brought before Interpol for a second time were politically motivated. In reality, she was being persecuted by her home country for refusing the sexual advances of police officers who had also detained and abused her for months. Even after her lawyers were able to get Interpol to delete the red notice that El Salvador had filed against her, ICE kept her locked up, and she spent more than 6 years in the US detained before being released in 2023. And the thing is, Barahona Martinez isn't alone. A Russian anti-corruption activist endured similar detention in ICE facilities for 2 years, based on a bogus red notice from Russia that alleged he committed fraud. At least 14 countries have misused international law enforcement tools for their political goals. So what has America done so far to tackle transnational repression? Red notice abuse is perhaps the area we've made the most progress in. In 2016 and 17, Interpol implemented a vetting process that tries to filter out bad faith requests. And in 2022, the federal government passed the TRAP Act as part of that year's National Defense Authorization, which requires reporting on Interpol abuse. Individual agencies like ICE in 2023 also announced new guidelines that would reduce their reliance on red notices. But experts warn that these reforms don't actually commit ICE to reporting publicly the information on its use of red notices, and that the guidelines don't actually apply to ongoing proceedings or other types of Interpol notices. At the federal level, Congress hasn't even passed a definition of what transnational repression even is. even though there's been a bill that was brought forward to do just that in 2023. Nor has it passed laws to strengthen coordination between federal, state, and local level agencies. And both of these ideas are things that experts on the issue recommend we do. So the slow federal response is part of the reason why individual states have started to make moves on their own. Nebraska and Texas were the first two states to pass transnational repression legislation, and California is on the verge of being the third state to pass laws that would train officers on this issue. Currently, SB 509 in California has passed both houses of the state legislature and is awaiting signature from Gavin Newsom. But the bill is now starting to face a lot of pushback from influential diaspora groups, who had also campaigned to kill an earlier version of the bill back in 2024. The main groups that oppose this legislation are largely Hindu and Indian diaspora organizations like the Hindu American Foundation, Hindu Pact, and the Coalition of Hindus in North America, which have documented ties to Hindu nationalist networks and often echo the positions of India's government. Although it's important to note that they've denied claims made by journalism outlets that they were unregistered foreign agents of India. The main claim that these groups make against SB 509 is that it will institutionalize discrimination against Indian Americans and that it would act as a Trojan horse to profile and discriminate against American Hindus. But after reading the bill myself, it appears to me that these claims aren't really rooted in any sort of reality that's in the text of the bill, because the bill doesn't explicitly single out any country or ethnicity or religion, nor does it create any new criminalization statutes that would be used to charge people with a crime. So it's hard to see how the provisions of this bill would specifically target Indians or Hindus. To me, what actually feels really hypocritical about the arguments they're making against SB 509 is that the hypothetical fears that these pro-India or Hindu diaspora groups have are actually the reality of what communities who are being targeted by transnational repression are facing right now. California is home to many of these targeted diasporas, from Cambodians to Sikhs to Uyghurs and Tibetans. And many of them have been saying that foreign regimes have been spying on them, intimidating them, or targeting them for years at this point. So if that's the lived experience of many of these communities, why make those arguments in the first place? Well, in a recent piece that was published by Al Jazeera, one Stanford professor explained the argument this way, quote, "When an organization comes out strongly against such a bill, it almost feels like a preemptive admission, as if they see themselves being implicated by what the bill seeks to prevent." So where do I stand on this whole debate within the Indian diaspora and on this issue? Well, I also have a bias here, and that's because I was put on a blacklist and deported from India, my ancestral homeland, for my award-winning journalism while I was a producer at Vice News. Now, groups like the Sikh Coalition, who are proponents of SB 509, have used my case in a report that they used to document the effects of transnational repression on the Sikh diaspora in America. And while what happened to me is not nearly as severe as what many others in the United States are facing because of their political or personal beliefs, I do think it's important that I share my own backstory to add context to help you understand the potential biases I might have had when I wrote this report. But with all of that being acknowledged, I still find it hard to believe that any effort to further educate our own law enforcement on the issue at hand could be perceived as harmful, especially in a world where both state and federal law officers and systems have already been used by foreign agents and oppressive governments to commit transnational repression. To me, it feels like the bare minimum we should be doing is training our public servants to be equipped to handle this rapidly evolving threat to our national security. But I'd love to know what you think. So if you have strong feelings either way, please leave it in the comments below. And I'll also be leaving some links to the policy papers and resources that I used to research and write this report. Thank you all so much for listening. I know this was a longer one than usual, but I really hope you liked it. And make sure to subscribe if you haven't. Give me a follow, and shout once again to my Patreon followers and fans. I really, really appreciate you all watching, and I'll see y'all on the next one.